Chapter 12, Imperial Ambitions and Sectional Crises, or Crisis. So this is 1842 to 1861. So we're going to back up a little bit, and we're going to talk about kind of leading up to the Civil War and what's going on for these sections, the North and the South, and arguably even the East and the West. Why are they at odds with each other? So this chapter, it has several different sections. Let's go over the sections really quickly before we just dive into the chapter. We're gonna look at claiming the West. We're gonna look at expansion and the politics of slavery, sectional crisis intensify, and from sectional crisis all the way to Southern secession. Why did the Southern states decide to leave the Union? So the first thing we're going to start off looking at is claiming the West and traveling the overland trail. So travel on overland trails, that really increased after the 1830s. So opposed to taking the sea routes, right? Instead of trying to get on a ship in Boston Harbor, sail all the way down the North American coastline, all the way down past the southern tip of South America and back up, we're going to travel overland because a lot of people couldn't afford the expense of a ship and taking the water routes. So instead, they're going to travel overland. And that really increased after the 1830s, and it's spurred by the encouraging letters that earlier settlers and missionaries, such as the Whitmans and the Spaldings, sent back east. The possibilities for new opportunities in the West, especially after the Panic of 1837, that drew U.S. migrants and European immigrants, and settlements began to grow near trading posts and forts. Over 350,000 Americans had journeyed west on the Oregon Trail by 1860, expanding the American empire. The expense of the trip meant that Western pioneers were mostly from the middle class, and 60% of them were men. Here is a depiction of an immigrant party headed to California in 1850. This is very deceiving, but this would have probably been used to entice people to go on the overland trails out west. If you look, like these people over here sitting down and resting, maybe catching up, looks like maybe she has a baby she's taking care of. But it also looks like, oh, it's this really nice wide mountain path. We all know those are not wide mountain paths, very treacherous mountains that they're going over. And all depending on when you left, the weather played a huge role in a successful trip or an unsuccessful trip. What we also see are gender divisions of labor really shifted along the trail, as adherence to traditional roles was made more difficult by traveling conditions. So when men died or they were ill on the trail, their wives were forced to take on more responsibilities. Yet women were still denied input into decision-making, and men rarely took on women's responsibilities. The journey was made more difficult by death, injury, and illness, all of which occurred frequently, with 1 in 10 to 15 migrants dying on the trail. Some 20% of women on the trail became pregnant, which also posed significant dangers. Then we also have the gold rush, and that's going to entice even more people to start moving out west. So California, they initially drew on a limited number of American settlers, many of whom married into wealthy Mexican ranching families. The discovery of gold in California in 1849 resulted in a population explosion as 49ers from all over the United States and from around the world rushed to the California mountains to make their fortunes in about 1849, hence 49ers. The massive influx of a diverse population exacerbated tensions between newly arrived whites and people who are already living in California, such as the Californios or Mexican ranchers and local Indians. These relations were further complicated when immigrants from Asia and South America joined the search for wealth. The domestic and health needs of male miners created work opportunities for women, but exploitation, especially of non-white women, was often a result. Chinese men were also victims of violence and theft, and many turned to providing domestic services, such as cooking and washing clothes, to earn income. Levi Strauss, a German Jewish immigrant, he's going to make his fortune by producing denim pants that will hold up to the wear and tear of mining. Here's just a picture of some gold rush miners in 1849. You'll notice one of them is of Asian descent, working alongside, probably, this looks like an Anglo, probably a U.S. immigrant that went out there in search of gold. What does that do? Well, all that rush into California, it leads to a crowded land because you've got your traditional Hispanic families, the cattle ranchers that have been there since the 1500s, but then you also have Native Americans who've been living there way longer than the Spanish have. And so with this westward expansion, yes, it brought new settlers and the U.S. government into competition with powerful Indian nations for land. Conflict between whites and Indians intensified as the number of white settlers increased. Violence erupted in several instances. There's an example that your book gives you when Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and 10 other settlers who were killed by some Indians in retaliation for a deadly measles epidemic. Settlers did not always distinguish between Indian groups, using an attack by one tribe as justification for attacking any tribes that they came into contact with. Environmental changes, white diseases, and intertribal conflict reduced Indian numbers and power in the 1840s and 1850s, as evidenced by the plight of the Comanche Nation. The political and trading power of the Comanches had been reduced due to the overextension of their empire and depopulation of the bison. When the Comanche Empire collapsed, other tribes rushed into the power vacuum, reigniting intertribal wars on southern plains. Oops, I'm sorry about that. There we go. African Americans, they also were part of the westward expansion, and sometimes willingly, but most often as slaves fled from cruel owners, including the Creek Indians, and sometimes against their will as slaves. Just to give you an idea of kind of these overland passes. So the first one here to the south, this is the Santa Fe Trail, and it goes from Independence, Missouri. Kind of different routes you can go along here, but all the way to Santa Fe, which will become, it's part of the New Mexico Territory. The Oregon Trail, probably the most infamous of all of these. There was even a computer game named after it. You can still play that computer game. I think they have an app for it now called Oregon Trail. But again, starts here in Independence, Missouri, and goes all the way out to the Oregon Territory. Then you have the California Trail that split off from the Oregon Trail and goes a little bit southward into California. Then you have the Mormon Trail all the way to Salt Lake City. The Spanish Trail, which goes from Santa Fe to Los Angeles. And then just kind of showing you the Great Plains area. You'll notice all the tribes in the Great Plains as well. So, pretty good little map there. Kind of showing you the diversity of the Indian nations and also the different routes and different trails you could take depending on where you wanted to end up. In 1849, California is going to apply to become a state. So they apply for admission to the Union and they apply as a free state. What that's going to lead to is protests from Southerners who knew that the addition of another free state would shift the sectional balance in Congress. So in response, President Zachary Taylor suggested that slavery's expansion be allowed throughout the West. And that's going to anger a lot of Northern Whigs, the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. The fight over California occurred at the same time as other congressional debates, including conflicts over slavery and some problems that had arisen with Texas. Senator Henry Clay proposed a compromise that included California's entry into the Union as a free state, popular sovereignty being used to resolve slavery issues for the remaining land acquired from Mexico. If you'll recall, popular sovereignty, I believe that's a key term in your book, but what that means is you let the people living in that area decide for themselves. They vote whether they want to be free or slave. A new fugitive slave law, so they're going to re-up the old fugitive slave law. And the compromise offered something to all groups, but it's not immediately popular. And senators on both sides of the slavery issue, they opposed the compromise, and Congress adjourned without deciding really what are we going to do with California. So developments in the fall of 1850 shifted the political landscape before Congress reconvened. Henry Clay, he retired, and John C. Calhoun, who had opposed the compromise, he ends up dying. If you'll recall, he was Jackson's vice president, and he had talked about secession in the 1830s before we were actually going to see secession in the 1860s. But he dies, and so did President Taylor. And Taylor's death moved Millard Fillmore into the presidency, and he appointed a guy named Daniel Webster, and Webster supports the compromise. He appointed him to his cabinet, removing Webster from the Senate. So we have a lot of shifting. It's only like, 4 guys, But in reality, that's a lot of shifting that's happening within the Senate. And the changes in the Senate and Fillmore's support for the measure pushed the Compromise of 1850 through Congress. Its passage temporarily resolved the sectional crisis, but it really does leave slavery's future and the nation's prospective response unclear. So what does the Fugitive Slave Act do? We're going to re-up it. It's an old act, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it was part of that Compromise of 1850. It strengthened and harshened previous fugitive slave laws, in part by making individual citizens responsible for enforcing it. Not just local law officials like your local lawmen. Now it's every individual citizen is responsible for enforcing it. And of course, Northerners are like, but we don't even have slaves. We are not going to support it. And so they objected, arguing the federal government had gone too far in protecting the Southern institution of slavery. Prior to the Fugitive Slave Act, free blacks and a number of white allies had fought against slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act increased the number of Northern abolitionists who helped blacks escape enslavement via the Underground Railroad. A provision of the Fugitive Slave Act made free blacks vulnerable to being kidnapped or arrested as runaways. And here's why. Because they're getting paid. Commissioners are paid $10 for sending a slave back south, but only $5 if a slave is not returned. So what they're doing is they're taking free blacks and claiming that they're runaway slaves. In reality, they've never been a slave. But now they're selling them into slavery because they can make $10 off of it. They can make a profit. And you have to remember, $10 back then, that's a lot of money. That's usually like over a month's salary. Sometimes that was a year's salary for some people, but that's 3 or 4 months' pay. And you're getting paid to sell a person into slavery. So that's why all these free blacks are vulnerable to this kidnapping. It's what happens to Solomon Northup. The 12 Years a Slave. It's a true story that was turned into a movie, and that's exactly what happened to him. He's kidnapped and sold into slavery. Here's the Anti-Fugitive Slave Law Convention that took place in New York in 1850. You'll notice it's a mixed group of people. I don't know if you guys can tell who that is. That's Frederick Douglass sitting there at the front. So a lot of abolitionists, those are against slavery, they protested the law and worked to free fugitive slaves who had been arrested. Despite the negative reactions of foreign governments to the slave law and to the violence that pervaded the institution of slavery, Northern abolitionists and Southern slaveholders proved unwilling to compromise further. So there's 2 major parties, and they attempted to avoid the slavery issue when the next election comes up in 1852. The Democrats, they nominate Franklin Pierce. He is a Northerner, but he opposes abolition. And the Whigs nominated General Winfield Scott. He's a Southerner who kept silent on the issue of slavery. The Free Soil Party, they failed to take advantage of Northern anger over the Fugitive Slave Act, and they end up nominating John P. Hale, a relatively unknown former senator. Franklin Pierce, spoiler alert, he wins. His victory caused some political shifting as it left the Whigs and the Free Soilers in disarray. The problem with Pierce, though, is he's inexperienced and he has splintered his cabinet, and that left him struggling with contradictory advice. And he ultimately resorted to following his own expansionist vision. And from the start of his administration, Pierce worked to extend U.S. trade, and he succeeded in expanding the United States' commercial and diplomatic ties with Japan. He does open up more Asian markets to the U.S. economy. He looked to extend the American empire into the Caribbean and Central America, but here we're going to have some divisions within the United States, and that's going to undermine an attempt to get Cuba from Spain. Some politicians, including members of Pierce's cabinet, they pressured the president to annex Cuba, and they justified a forceful takeover of Cuba in this manifesto that they come out with. And when Northerners learned of this, they're like, hang on, y'all. You're trying to bring in Cuba, which is just not very far off of the southern coastline of the United States. You bring in Cuba, are you going to try to bring it as a slave state to the Union? So you're going to try to get a one-up on the Northerners and throw off the balance in the Senate again by adding another slave state. So overall, Pierce, he's unable to realize his goals regarding expansion, But his efforts to do so produced even more sectional conflict. That whole thing over Cuba, it's like Northerners are convinced of the Southern conspiracy of slavery trying to take over. And so what we're going to see is this sectional crisis is going to intensify even more. And galvanized by the Fugitive Slave Act that comes out in 1850, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she's a white lady, but she publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. And her novel built on the narratives of fugitive slaves concerning their time in slavery, as well as the expanding abolitionist literature. She herself is not a slave. She's not a slave owner. She's just combining these stories and some of the abolitionist literature in order to create this narrative called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her work exceeded all other abolitionist literature in terms of popularity by offering these very vivid depictions of saintly slaves and their sufferings at the hands of these really cruel overseers and white masters. The novel provided a way for Northerners to more easily identify with slaves. Tens of thousands of abolitionists in Boston, they come out and they protest the return of Anthony Burns to slavery. Anthony Burns is a fugitive slave to his master, and while their initial attempts to free Burns failed, supporters are able to purchase his freedom a year later, and the entire incident forced Bostonians to wonder how they had come so far in abetting slavery. Like aiding and abetting, that kind of abetting slavery. How they were like helping continue the institution of slavery. Okay, so we're going to have a new territory that's going to come in. And it's all because Senator Douglas of Illinois, he wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, one that would connect the east all the way out to the west. And so he reopens this whole slavery debate with that proposal to establish that transcontinental railroad. In order to gain Southern support for a northern route, he proposed a plan that would invalidate the Missouri Compromise. Remember the Missouri Compromise? You can't allow slavery to the north of that Missouri Compromise line with the exception of Missouri. So he's going to invalidate that Missouri Compromise by allowing popular sovereignty to decide the fate of slavery in two new territories north of the 1820 boundary. We're going to look at a map in just a second. After months of fierce debate along sectional lines, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's going to pass through Congress in May of 1854 when most Democrats followed the party line and voted to allow popular sovereignty in those two territories. Northerners blamed what they called the slave power conspiracy for the act's passage. The act negatively impacted Plains Indians whose previous treaties were ignored, as white settlers rushed onto their lands in the wake of the act. Frustration with the two major political parties resulted in the creation of two new parties in time for the 1854 congressional elections. The American Party, which had a lot of support from anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant nativists, and the Republican Party, formed by anti-slavery Whigs and former Free Soilers. Okay, so what's this whole Kansas-Nebraska thing? So here's the Kansas Territory. Here's the Nebraska Territory. Here's the Missouri Compromise line. What Stephen Douglas wants to do, he's from Illinois. What he wants to do is open up a transcontinental railroad that will go through this area all the way out to the West Coast. And he's like, well, I know that we made this law that says you're not supposed to have slavery like north of this red line, but let's just let the people living in these territories decide if they want to be slave states or free states when they join the Union. And Northerners like, wait, what? No, we can't do that. So it's going to create a huge debate in Congress, and it's going to be called Bleeding Kansas for a reason. So Abraham Lincoln, he's a former Whig, and he's a successful Illinois lawyer. And he had briefly served in the House of Representatives. He's going to join the Republican Party in 1856. By 1856, the Republican Party had become one of the nation's two major parties, and they have more support than earlier anti-slavery coalitions had received by complementing its opposition to the expansion of slavery with the advocacy of industrial and commercial development, also wanting internal improvement. So not only are they anti-slavery, but they want all this other stuff as well. We want to improve, we want to get rid of slavery, but we also want to internally improve the infrastructure, the roads, industry, commercial development. We want all those improvements as well. So we have the party, it's really a mix of abolitionists and men who wanted only to keep slavery out of Western territories. I told you it was coming out Bleeding Kansas in the election of 1856. So popular sovereignty in Kansas Territory, it resulted in Southerners and Northerners moving to the territory to attempt to sway the vote over slavery. Southerners established a pro-slavery government at Shawnee Mission in Kansas, while abolitionists created an anti-slavery stronghold in Lawrence. Violence in Lawrence resulted in Eastern abolitionists raising funds to send weapons to Kansas. The territory soon became known as Bleeding Kansas due to all these violent incidents, such as when longtime abolitionist John Brown, his 4 sons, and 2 others massacred 5 pro-slavery Kansans in the Potawatomi Massacre. Southern settlers responded to the massacre by declaring Kansas a slave state. And guess what? President Pierce approves it. We also have the Dred Scott decision. That's not going to help matters either. In 1857, the Supreme Court announced its decision in the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner was a military guy, and he had kind of moved from slave states, into free territories. So when he dies, Dred Scott sues for his freedom, saying, I was held as a slave in a free territory. I shouldn't be a slave. I should be set free because of that time I spent in that free territory. So Chief Justice Roger Taney, he argued for the majority that blacks were not citizens, and thus they could not sue in court, and that Congress had no constitutional authority to exclude slavery from any territory, which nullified the Missouri Compromise and any future attempt to restrict slavery. Y'all, he came down and said, all you free blacks that have been living in the United States, guess what? You're no longer citizens, and therefore you cannot sue in court. Like, wait, what? But we pay taxes. Doesn't matter. You're not considered a citizen before the law anymore. This ruling, that's going to convince Northerners that the slave power conspiracy had reached the federal government. During the Illinois Senate race of 1858, Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln argued that his opponent, Stephen Douglas, could not support both popular sovereignty and Dred Scott, since Dred Scott protected slavery everywhere, regardless of the wishes of residents. Douglas argued that a territory's residents could block slavery in practical terms by not supporting local legislation to protect slaveholders' property. Lincoln warned that the national division over slavery could not continue indefinitely. Douglas ends up winning the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but he feared the growing power of the South within his own party, and he and Buchanan fought over control of the party when Douglas opposed Kansas's pro-slavery constitution. So remember John Brown, his 4 sons, and those 2 friends that ended up massacring 5 people at Potawatomi? Well, he strongly believed that a violent overthrow of slavery was the only answer, and that God wanted him to effect the liberation of the enslaved. So Brown hoped to spark a rebellion by arming slaves in Virginia with weapons seized from a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. In October of 1859, Brown and 18 followers managed to seize the arsenal. But the state militia and federal troops killed or captured all the rebels within a few days. Brown was found guilty of murder, criminal conspiracy, and treason on October 31st. He was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. His execution made him martyr to the Northerners, but Southerners feared he was part of a larger anti-slavery plot, a larger abolitionist plot. Many Northerners viewed Brown as a hero for giving his life to the cause of the emancipation of slaves, although Northern politicians worried that the raid would only intensify sectional tensions. Southern whites felt that their way of life was continuously under attack despite their attempts to justify slavery, and both Northerners and Southerners viewed the election of 1860 as a critical step for deciding the nation's future. So the election of 1860, we had the Republican platform. They rejected violent actions, such as Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, and highlighted the exclusion of slavery from Western territories, but not abolition, internal improvements and protective tariffs, and Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, the guy who had lost the Senate race. And they focused on winning majorities in states outside of the South. Sectional divisions within the Democratic Party resulted in the nomination of 2 Democratic candidates. Northern Democrats, they're going to elect Stephen Douglas, and Southern Democrats voted to run John Breckinridge on a pro-slavery expansion platform. And then we also have a third party, the newly created Constitutional Union Party. They nominated John Bell. What ends up happening? The election results demonstrated a deeply divided electorate, with Lincoln carrying the free states in the Middle Atlantic and Midwest, which had a large number of electoral votes. Abolitionists hoped that Lincoln's victory would result in Lincoln and the Republican Party becoming more sympathetic to abolitionism. Southerners were furious that Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. Well, you shouldn't have split up the Democratic Party if you didn't want the Republicans to win. So that was their mistake. Because of that split within the Democratic Party and running two candidates on the Democratic ticket, you've ruined your chances to win the presidential election. And that's how Lincoln is able to win without carrying a single Southern state. So you'll notice here, free speech, free homes, free territory. And also notice up here, the Union must and shall be preserved, trying to hold the Union together. You'll also notice here, protection to American industry. That's another thing that was on the Republican platform. Not only are we're talking about abolitionism, yes, but we're not like out there promoting the ending of slavery. But we are talking about these other things such as protection to American industry, creating a better infrastructure, better commerce, that kind of thing. Here is the election of 1860, just to give you an idea. So John C. Breckinridge, he's the Southern Democrat. You can tell he carries the entire South, right? He also carries, what is that? Maryland and is that Delaware? Rhode Island? Delaware, I think. Terrible with my states. And then you'll notice Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, he only carries 2. Doesn't do a very good job. Missouri. John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, he carries 3 states. And then Abraham Lincoln, he carries these states that have the population's really big, so you've got a lot of electoral votes, electoral college votes, like New York. I mean, they've got 35. Pennsylvania's got 27. So, but he carries all the North and the West also. South Carolina. They were the first of 7 Southern states to secede from the Union in protest of the 1860 election. In February of 1861, the 7 states adopted a provisional constitution. They elected Jefferson Davis as their new president and established the Confederate States of America. President Buchanan did nothing in the wake of these actions. It's a lame duck, basically, is what we call the end of his presidency. Northerners were divided, with some supporting the departure of those states, whereas others felt the seceded states would return once their economic survival proved impossible. Kentucky Senator John Crittenden attempted to find a compromise, proposing a plan in which slavery would be protected where it already existed through a constitutional amendment. But Republicans rejected a second part of his plan that would have extended the Missouri Compromise line to the California border, as they felt it would encourage Southern planters to once again seek territory in Cuba, Central America, and Mexico, and expand slavery into those areas. So it's a last kind of ditch effort that Crittenden throws out there, the Crittenden Compromise, but it's going to be rejected by Lincoln and others in Congress. So here we have the first 7 states. It gives you the order that they left. Texas was number 7. But South Carolina is the first one to leave, followed by Mississippi, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas. Other slave states. We've got Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. Not all of these will leave the Union. We have some of these border states. Virginia's not one of them. West Virginia will be. But we do have some of these border states that are going to remain with the North. And so they're slave states. They do have slavery, but they don't ever leave the Union. And that's going to be really important when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in the next chapter.